Hello everyone, I'm Randall Mendenhall alongside Brad Ross on location at the Range Systems Studio. Brad works with many of our commercial range customers and is the go-to guy for people in the early stages of planning and designing a range. Brad's topic today is rubber versus steel bullet trap. Which is better? Brad, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, and thank everyone for attending the webinar.
Well, let's get started here. Brad, why is this question so important?
Well, its importance comes from the fact that the whole business plan of building a shooting range is designed around firing projectiles and safely capturing them. So obviously it's one of the primary range components, literally the focus of each shooter on the range, whether it's in a commercial setting or training. And then there's also, it's an important question because there is a lot of information out there, a lot of perceptions, a lot of inaccurate or misinformation in the industry. So it's important to really determine what's better for for each circumstance. It's a large cost, a big factor in the overall equipment costs, and then obviously with shooting involved, safety is a paramount concern for everybody.
Well, we pose the question rubber versus steel bullet trap, which is better? But really, Brad, what should the question be?
Well, and that's a perfect way to get into what we're going to talk about today, is because it's not which is better. It's which trap is better for me and how I plan on using it. Both types of traps have been around a long time. They all have their pros and cons. But if they're, here at Range Systems, we carry 3 different types of traps, and if one was one size fits all, we would cut down on our SKU count, make it a lot easier for the customers. But the fact of the matter is, the features and advantages and benefits of these different types of traps are there to suit the needs of the individual, and to determine that, you really have to ask the questions of how is the range going to be used? What are the activities? Is it just straight line fixed position shooting, or is there tactical training? And those kinds of activities need to be brought out and used in the determination of what trap is best. For the commercial range customers, which one best supports the revenue plan? It's an important thing. Being a for-profit business, those things, how it's going to be used, how it's going to make money for you, how much it's going to cost, those things are all pretty important, especially for the commercial range customers. And because most folks looking to build a range have been in the industry, and not all but most, and have a bit of a passion or background, there might have been things that they've seen or used, they have concerns or pain points, or they're just strictly, I don't want that for my business. So that some of those things should be brought out in the open to determine how the trap choice is going to support that. And then we'll get into this a little bit later, but how much space do I have? They're all different shapes and sizes. What's my space? Do I have an existing building? Do I have to build the suit? So those are some of the questions. What is the best bullet trap for me is important, because nobody should be able to tell you that without fleshing some of these important factors out.
Well, let's go ahead and help our audience today determine which bullet trap is best for me. And we put together a list here. What 9 factors must I consider to make the best decision? How could this help our audience make their determination? What are we going to cover here?
Well, as you can see, why nine? It's more than eight, less than 10. There's really no reason. There are probably a number of other considerations to take, but these are some of the ones that I run across on a pretty regular basis, and in a lot of cases, and why I chose some of these are the person the customer or prospect I'm speaking with, they haven't even considered these. So these are things that if you haven't thought about, you really need to add into your process on determining, the equipment and the setup of the range. Again, there's probably more, and maybe some of these aren't relevant to everyone. For example, number 9, revenue opportunity. That's obviously going to speak more to the commercial range owners rather than law enforcement qualification range. So we'll just kind of go through one by one, talk about some of the the differences, the pros, the cons of each type of trap, and hopefully answer some questions and better yet, stimulate new ones from our audience here.
Excellent. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Factor number 1, obviously money is very important regardless of customer segment. So factor number 1, what is my initial investment? What should our audience know, Brad?
Well, yeah, money is always a driver. Not always the biggest, but usually one of the top, which is why I have it listed number 1. But I want to point out that it's not the investment, it's the initial investment. That's what we're talking about right now. We'll get into some of the other things like cost of ownership as we go through the presentation here. But initial investment is really going to be related to a couple of things: the equipment costs, the transporting of that to your location, and then the installation of the equipment. So depending on the model, and there's several companies out there, they have different options. So this is just kind of I guess an average of what's out there. Depending on the model, steel traps are typically 3 to 5 times higher on the equipment cost than rubber traps. Part of the reason for that is there's just more to it. There's more, I guess I'll call them components or different technology, which really can add to the installation of it. It's a more difficult product to install. So the equipment is 3 to 5 times higher than rubber, but the install cost could also increase as well. Shipping costs, in the case of the average steel trap out there and the average rubber berm trap, actually the weights are pretty similar, which was surprising to me when I first heard it. So really negligible difference there for the initial costs.
All right, let's switch to our next factor, factor number 2. And here we have a photo of the backside of a range there. Factor number 2, what sound and air concerns do I have? What should our audience know about that?
Well, a couple of the main hot buttons out there are sound and air quality because of the nature of the lead being fired in the range. Obviously, we're not looking at a bullet trap here, but you can see there's a lot put into ranges in a general sense to ensure that sound is reduced, both within reverberating within the range as well as transferring outside of that range box. And then at the top you can see the ventilation diffuser on the top right. That's a pretty large and important piece of equipment, and these things are really designed to keep that pollution of sound and air to a minimum as much as possible. And the trap type that you get can affect this. the next bullet point there, using the phrase impact and redirect, which is your steel trap, versus tumble and friction that is used to encapsulate a round for the rubber trap. These things can, they greatly change the amount of sound and air pollution that's generated on a range. So just to go further on that, let's start with impact and redirect. The design of steel traps are to purposely create that violent collision between a bullet and hardened steel. And when that happens, the bullet breaks up into fragments. And the design of the trap redirects these rounds into, we call it a throat and a deceleration chamber to take the energy out so it can come to a stop. But that impact and redirect are important things. Impact we'll talk about now. Redirect we'll get into a little bit more later, but you're purposefully breaking apart the projectile, and that does create additional lead dust. Not to mention, in both cases of traps, you're going to have the sound of the firearm going off, but with a steel trap, you're hitting steel with a bullet, and look, people like shooting steel targets because they hear that ping. Well, now you got ping after ping after ping on 10 lanes on a range. It creates a lot more noise. The concept of tumble and friction and using those to encapsulate a round, that's what's used for rubber berm traps. The round goes into the rubber media and actually gets thrown off of its axis and starts to tumble, and then uses the friction of the rubber and the tumbling of the round to take the energy out and come to a stop and be captured in the rubber. Obviously, when we're not having that violent collision, we're going to be not creating the same amount of lead dust. Rounds in the tumble and friction method stay relatively intact. They might hit other projectiles that are already in the rubber, but relatively they stay intact. And that does change the amount of sound and lead dust because you're not clanking steel and breaking apart the projectile. Now, for steel traps with the impact and redirect, there is so I guess speaking of pros and cons, it's recommended to have a secondary air filtration unit called the dust collection unit, or DCU. This is a unit that attaches to the trap where the fragments and lead dust go into to help try to mitigate that and pull it into a secondary collection area, so it's not as aggressive on your main ventilation filters. On the flip side, because the rounds are broken into pieces and dropped into a collection area on a steel trap, and in a rubber trap they collect in there, the capacity in between major cleanings is a little bit less on a rubber trap because they don't go anywhere after that. They stay in there, they're encapsulated, whereas a steel trap, they drop down either into a bucket or a common collection system, and that clears way for a higher volume for your major cleanings.
Well, I think those are good points to take in account here as we work through and consider each type of bullet trap. And continuing on, you talked about the lead dust there. Let's move to factor number 3. What routine maintenance will I have to do?
Well, and this is a good spot for this slide, because where I talk about just finishing up with capacity on the range of rounds in between the two traps, that doesn't change the routine maintenance that's needed. The routine maintenance, changing oil on your car, rotating your tires, those are things you do to help maintain a smooth running vehicle, and those of us who have teenage boys who drive cars and don't check their oil as often as they should, they know that can lead to problems. So that routine maintenance is important on cars, and it's important on with your range equipment, specifically your bullet traps. The maintenance will help reduce or eliminate repairs down the road. The maintenance required on steel versus rubber are pretty different, though. Both traps are going to need ventilation filter changes. There is some lead dust cleaning on both, and the removal. But really, the trap cleaning, when we talk about how different they are, that's what I want to touch upon a little bit more. So the misconception on a steel trap is that, well, heck, the rounds go in there, they drop into the bucket, I grab the bucket, I go and take it in, and we're good to go. It's steel. What could go wrong? There's maintenance, no maintenance required. Well, that's a big misconception that can lead to huge repair costs down the road, because again, we're creating that violent collision and breaking apart these rounds into small pieces of dust. And even if you have a separate dust collection unit, that dust gets everywhere. And if it's not routinely cleaned out, your repairs for a steel trap are going to be the least of your concerns. Your biggest concern is going to find someone who's brave enough and small enough to fit inside that deceleration chamber with a torch and a chisel, because that stuff gets on there and acts as a weld, and really can gunk up the system, so your steel trap isn't working as efficiently as it should. So ensuring that lead dust is clean from behind the trap, in the trap, on the ramps, it's pretty important. I think later we'll see a photo that kind of demonstrates a steel trap with poor routine maintenance and how that can change things. With rubber traps, a lot less lead dust. Ventilation filters still need to be changed, but on average they need to be changed 4 to 5 times less often than ranges that have a steel trap. There is, lead dust around. The picture kind of, shows a guy shooting. Most of the lead dust is created on the impact of a round, which a rubber trap doesn't have, but there still are lead traces that come out of the firearm and around the firing line and that sort of thing. So there still is that lead dust cleaning, but it's a much to a much lesser degree. The cleaning of the trap basically consists of removing the lead, usually using a secondary, a third party that has a proper equipment, like vacuum separators, and they take the lead out and remove it and put the rubber back in. Beyond that, just simple, raking of the trap, maintaining the proper depth of rubber is really the maintenance required, or that routine maintenance required on a rubber berm trap.
Well, as we close off on this slide, I do want to point out here at the bottom on your handouts, you'll have a link where we have a blog post going a little bit more in depth there about the routine maintenance on that blog post. Well, you just spoke about the importance of repairs and what that might look like. So let's touch on our fourth factor. What will be the required repairs?
Well, and this is the slide I previously referred to, and this is a steel trap that that's in the industry. Not going to discuss the model or who made it, but this trap is it's showing a lot of wear from lack of maintenance, and you can really see, first of all, when I talk about that throat, there's that area right there where it's starting to close up, where that lead dust is really getting in there and creating a weld. And that's going to cause some problems. It's really going to prevent that trap from being able to not only work effectively but to be safe. And then lower down that ramp, you can see the collection of these lead fragments, and this is likely due to overusing this steel trap without doing the routine maintenance. So steel wears with heat, and when you have especially high volume ranges that take a lot of rounds, they get that wear. The steel starts to get deformed a little bit, and that's what I can only suspect happened here, because otherwise that lead dust wouldn't pool up in those areas. They have to be low spots, because that steel was not inspected on a regular basis or replaced as needed. So because of that, routine maintenance wasn't done. This is a trap that's having all kinds of issues. The biggest being the closing of that throat. That could cause some ricochets and that sort of thing. So, this photo really shows what neglect can do. This is going to be a pretty expensive repair. Likely, this customer reached out to to have us look at ripping out a trap and replacing it with a different type. That's just speculation, though. Neglect is really the biggest. Neglect of maintenance is really the biggest reason or cause of expensive repairs. Sure, there's faulty product from time to time that's usually taken care of by the manufacturer. Misuse or fatigue, those are key as well. But really, the big one is neglect. Neglect of the routine maintenance that's needed. And that kind of runs into these next bullet points. And I'll skip down one to the cost to replace the wear items. You have rubber and you have steel. So if you have to replace it, like the picture, if you have to replace those steel panels, that's going to be more expensive than having to top off the rubber after cleaning. You can get a bag of rubber for less than the price of a bag of dog food. Rubber is pretty resilient. When we talk about the lifespan, what lasts longer, almost everybody, their first quick twitch answer is, well, steel's got to last longer. And that's just the opposite. Steel deforms when it gets overheated, as I mentioned. Constant barrage of rounds will actually change the shape of the steel and damage it. Rubber just kind of moves out of the way. Sure, there's a little bit of topping off needed, a little bit of breakdown of the rubber, but again, it's cheap, it's easy, and even as it starts to break down, it's not leading to other issues like steel, where these plates are starting to break down. They got to be replaced at the start, or it leads to other issues. So effort needed. I guess emptying a bag of dog food or rubber into the top of a trap and raking it out versus undoing these steel products and disposing of them, but also replacing them. I think the effort for a steel trap, when you have to do that repairing or replacement of the equipment, is a much more expensive way to go. So.
Okay, well, we've talked about maintenance, repairs. Let's talk about something else related to those issues. Let's talk about lead reclamation. What do I need to know about lead reclamation, Brad?
Well, this is a big part. This is one of the leading drivers of outside of initial cost, one of the leading drivers of trap choice. is with the lead. Lead is highly desirable, and especially for commercial ranges, the beauty of the lead is customers will give it to you, not just for free, they'll pay you for it. Here's my money, and can you take this valuable recyclable as well? That's a pretty good gig, and a lot of commercial ranges, again speaking mostly to the commercial sector, rely on this as a part of revenue or to offset maintenance costs. So there's a couple of ways to do it. There are ranges out there that say, you know what, I'm gonna sell guns, I'm gonna rent guns, I'm gonna sell my ammo, do some retail, but my main goal is to get as many people to the firing line, putting as many rounds downrange as possible, because I want those buckets at the end to fill up so I can scoop them up and go and bring them in for that just reoccurring revenue stream. And it's a great revenue stream. And if you have a good source that gives you a fair price, then that could be an important part of that revenue driver. Those who are in the industry and have revenue sources that are maybe it's training, maybe it's various types of training classes and more retail and that sort of thing. With a rubber berm trap, it's not as easy to grab that bucket and go. You have to, in most cases, pay for somebody to come and do it, and then they grab that lead out of the trap. They clean up your trap, put the rubber back in, and they use that lead as payment towards the cleaning service. And depending on how much lead and the size of the range, it either covers most of it and you pay the difference. It's a wash, or in most cases, with 12 lanes or more is kind of the sweet spot. It becomes a revenue source for you, where they'll do the cleaning, they'll take the lead and cut you a check when it's all said and done. Much smaller check than the bucket collection or common collection system, but you don't have to do anything yourself. And as we talked about, up front, the bucket system is really steel trap versus as the picture shows, obviously that's a granular rubber trap. The lead, what has to be factored in by the range owner is, okay, if I'm looking at a 3 to 5 times the cost delta up front, plus some maybe other expenses, on a standard range, that could be $250,000. How many buckets do I have to fill up to pay for that delta? And if that answer, you do the math based on your business plan and your demographics, if that is to your advantage, then the steel trap, has an important leg up in at least when it comes to lead reclamation. What we're seeing a lot these days is just due to the hazardous nature, and frankly, the amount of rounds that are being put in these traps. The rubber berm type traps, they're not doing it themselves, although some are. They have a system for it, but they are hiring these third parties to come in and do it quickly, efficiently, look, these traps are designed to take a lot of rounds, and essentially, if you have 10 lanes, when it comes time to do the cleaning, you essentially have, like 4 or 5 Suburbans sitting in that berm trap. So that's a lot of lead, a lot of weight, and that generates a lot of money, and again, can be somewhat of a revenue source for you, depending on your business plan.
Yeah, I think that's a great visual there, Brad. When you envision that lead that's sitting in the trap, that is easily the weight of a full-size SUV in there. Well, let's move on to our next factor. And by the way, I've noticed some questions have already started coming in. If you do have a question, feel free to, again, ask it in the question box as I showed at the beginning of the webinar, and then we will go ahead and address that during our Q&A section. Let's move on to factor number 6. What kind of safety differences are there? And, you know, Brad, when we look at this, here we're looking at an individual firing very, very closely into a rubber granular trap, and then into the subset photo, we actually have, well, this is for me actually. It's from our high-speed video shoot that we did where we show a round entering a rubber gran trap. What can you tell us about the safety differences, Brad?
Well, look, you know, I'm not going to you know, sit here and say that you know, one trap's not safe, the other trap's safe. These traps in the industry have been around a long time, and regardless of who they come from, there's not a vendor out there who's going to provide you a bullet trap that's not designed with safety in mind. So I guess we'll start there. But where the differences come into play is really, again, you know, I hate to kind of beat this point, you know, too much, but it really depends on the activities you're going to do on the range, how you plan on using it. To me, that plays a huge factor into what trap is really best. So I've got customers who, you know, we talked about the bucket method. That's their driver. They don't, you know, hey, there is no safety issues there unless you're not doing the routine maintenance, but there is no safety issue. If you've got people at the firing line, you know, firing rounds, you know, all day long at this thing, a steel trap does a great job and it's perfectly safe. For those customers who, you know, maybe you're looking at, you know, doing some advanced training, some more tactical, off the mark type stuff, you know, that capture, you know, using tumble and friction versus the impact and redirect just makes for safer. Right? So this guy in the picture, this is actually a range in our building we use for testing and things. I've shot a number of different calibers standing this close at that trap, and still here to talk to you today. This is not something I would do with a steel trap. I would not stand that close to a steel trap. I wouldn't shoot at different angles at close distances. You know, and part of that reason is, look, bullets, you know, we talk about physics of bullets. Bullets are pretty predictable. You fire them, they have velocity, they have shape, they, you know, in ranges, you don't have to worry so much about, in indoor ranges, about, you know, the drop. You know where they're going to go until it hits something. And once it hits something, boy, it's like trying to, you know, figure out where a football bouncing around on a concrete driveway is going to go. It just can go anywhere. All bets are off. All physics are off. And you know, there are, when we look at rubber traps like the one we have here, there are no leading edges. There's no hard surfaces to change the physics of that bullet. We're encapsulating it. We're capturing it. In fact, if we refer back to the previous slide, where we have this shot of the steel trap, you can see here in that throat, there are a number of traps out there that have these vertical connectors in between the modules, and those are leading edges. And there's other designs out there where there's, you know, they remove those, but there are also other traps out there that have even more leading edges for that round to hit. So shooting directly into that or at different angles, you can see where that would change the physics, and you know, again, impact and redirect, that's only good when you know where it's going to go. Traps are not designed to have that. Steel traps are not designed to have a person this close shooting. That leads to standoff distances. Here, obviously, we can be right up to it on a rubber trap. If somebody's really looking to do some tactical or 270-degree on the move shooting, the rubber trap really has a strong advantage there over a steel trap. Steel trap, you want to be back. Distances are going to vary based on the design of the trap, and frankly, the bravery of the shooter. Myself, I wouldn't advance downrange at a steel trap at all. Rubber, I have no problem. So.
All right, well, we just talked about the physics of bullets and how that works. Let's stay on that issue a little bit and take it a little bit deeper. And I know this is some consideration that can be important for our commercial members of the audience. Factor number 7, how do rubber and steel differ with caliber ratings? And on this slide here, we're looking at a cutaway view of a rubber granular trap to help illustrate that. So what can you tell us about that, Brad?
Yeah, so, as you mentioned, this could play a huge role, especially with some of the commercial customers. Both traps can be designed to really take any caliber. There's steel trap offerings that are pistol, rifle, and then, more, up to a 50 caliber type trap. And same thing with rubber. Here's the big difference between those when you start looking at these higher calibers. With steel, simple, thicker steel, right? You go from a 3/8 inch, you go to a 1/2 inch, whatever the design is. So you're just adding more steel that can take that impact on the impact and redirect approach. So, as far as fatigue, again, heat, number of rounds, all those things are going to change that. But that's what you have. It's a little heavier, and a little bit more expensive, but very simple to do. There's designs out there. You just change the thickness of the steel on the ramps. With rubber, very similar. All we do is change the depth of that rubber. So where steel, you're still doing that redirect, the impact and redirect. With rubber, we're still looking to encapsulate those rounds with that tumble and friction. And on the picture here, this is just kind of a demo unit that we have in our office so people can see a side view. This is our standard depth grand trap, and from we're at a depth of 18 inches, as the ramp, but because of the angle, when rounds are fired in, there's more than 18 inches to be able to slow down and capture that round. Now, different calibers are going to change, are going to determine how far into that granular they go. Most pistol rounds, go, handful of inches. Rifle rounds, maybe double that. But there's enough media here and enough depth. In this case, and this is just speaking with for a range systems trap. This is enough depth to capture, a 7.62 308 caliber. Should we want to go up to some of the more, more exotics, let's say big hunting area, and people want to sight in their 300 Win Mags, 338, what have you. Maybe not 50 cal, but they want to shoot something with a little bit more velocity than the standard rifles. All we do is we increase that depth. So we have 3 different levels for this, depending on if you want up to a 50 cal, just under that, or if you want to just keep it under that 7.62. Steel, again, you're changing the thickness. What can be different when so caliber ratings, I guess I'll piggyback this in with some of the exotics out there. A lot of ranges do not require people to buy their own so people buy their ammo, so people can sneak in some crazy ammunition. And one big difference between the steel and the rubber is some of these exotic, these penetrating rounds, green tips and steel core, probably dozens that I've never even heard of, that are designed to really penetrate through hard surfaces. They're not going to be good for steel traps, even though there's an angle and there's that deflection. You're still creating that impact, and once you start pitting up that steel again, you're changing the physics. Rubber, for the most part, doesn't care. What you want to shoot a steel core, once it hits that rubber, it's going to knock it off its axis just the same and tumble and use friction to have it come to a stop. So there's really no difference, with some of the different loads out there. We get a lot of questions on the surplus, M855 green tip round. Doesn't bother the granular rubber at all.
Well, let's continue on then to our 8th factor. What are space and structural requirements? Obviously, this may change as you adapt a different bullet trap there, but what are we looking at on the on this image here? We're looking at a side view of a drawing. So what are some of the space and structural requirements, Brad?
Yeah, we talked about initial cost. We don't want to, get too in depth with some of this, but just things that you need to ask yourself as you're going through the process, or ask your range provider. When you have a building, whether you're leasing, building, what have you, square foot costs, the rise, obviously, the higher the square footage needs, the higher your cost is going to be. So the footprint of a trap could be important, and then even skipping down to the bottom bullet point, some traps require service space to be able to service the trap behind it. So an example on the picture here is we have a granular rubber trap that has a depth of 15 foot. So if you want to maintain a specific target distance, that stops at the toe of the trap. Okay, so from here back to the firing line,
right there
is your target distance. You have to add this nearly 15 foot on top of it, and it's recommended, although not required with this type of trap design, to have that space behind to be able to service the hopper. With steel traps, and there's a variety out there. I can't touch on all of them, but the average, the more common steel traps are going to have a footprint of about, instead of 14 foot 11 inches, they're going to be, 21 to 27 feet. And not only that, they're required to have that additional space behind. You got to grab those buckets somehow. So you have to be able to get back there. So essentially, you could almost need twice the footprint there. So square foot costs have to be taken into consideration. And then, the building itself. Now, there's a variety, again, of steel traps. A number of them require the top ramp to be hung from the overhead structure. So oftentimes you need a secondary support structure. And with rubber, that just sits on the floor with no additional footings that some steel traps need, where they need some additional concrete work. And then, I guess, lastly, is if you have a current space, that concrete where that ramp comes down, you can't have that leading edge there, so you really have to cut into the floor to create a trench for that bottom plate to sit into. So
I think those are all good points, and we also have a blog post here as I'm referencing. Again, you can click on that link in your PDF handouts where we do go much more in depth on that new versus existing building topic. All right, well, let's hit up our last factor, factor number 9. And again, not everybody on the webinar is commercial, but it is an important factor. What kind of revenue opportunity will I have, Brad?
Yeah, and for those not in the commercial, I apologize, but this is important for those that are. You know, the lead reclamation, we talked about that. You know, how important of a source is that for you versus some of these other factors? You have to, you know, have a weighted average, or, you know, weigh that out with the other factors to consider. Um, you know, there's revenue and there's cost of ownership. We talked about some of these things with you know, the maintenance, but do you need to have additional, are you the guy that just wants to collect the lead and sell the ammo and rent the guns, or do you want to do some of these downrange activities as you see in the picture here? This is a range customer of ours that does competitions in there and has a full tactical range. Um, they wouldn't be able to do this with a steel trap. So off the mark training, close quarter, close retention, these are the type of training activities that you can do safer. I suppose you can do them on others, it's just not safe on a rubber trap over a steel trap. So these activities really have to be taken into consideration along with some of these other things we talked about today.
Well, before we get into our key takeaways and wrap up here, I do want to make one note of additional resources. In particular, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, the NSSF, has a great area on their website where they've got a lot of good information, a roster of range suppliers and consultants, industry information. So go ahead and check that out. The link there would be in your handouts. And then also here at Range Systems, we do have our Range Systems Range Design Guide, which is available. Well, Brad, to wrap up before we jump into the Q&A part of our webinar, what would you say the key takeaways are for our audience today?
Well, you know, because there are some considerations and some maybe even beyond what we talked about, engage with a shooting range provider sooner rather than later. I can't tell you how many times I speak with somebody and they're trying to do the right thing and get through the process as quickly as they can, and then I have to be the bearer of bad news to say, well, this isn't going to work because of that reason. So, you know, I would go back to the first slide, or you know, one of the first few slides, and say engage with the shooting range provider, but one that's going to talk to you about how you're going to use the space, what your needs are, before just, you know, providing a solution. It's hard to do that without knowing what you're trying to solve. So you know, and with that, ask which trap is best for you, and not just which trap is better. Everyone's got an opinion on that. The only one that matters is yours. So really make that an important part of your due diligence there. Keep in mind all the cost considerations. Here's the material cost. Well, how much is it going to be to maintain? How much is it going to be to you know, to ship or install, or those kinds of things? These are important things that, you know, again, for the commercial folks especially. You know, this is a business, and you can save a bunch of money up front and all kinds of equipment, but if it's going to cost you in the long run, that's still eats into the profit. So and then, you know, look at your revenue opportunities. Where do you want to drive the revenue? It could be, you know, I think this is one of the strongest things that can alter or help create or make your choice of what type of trap is best for your situation. So I guess those would be the main takeaways.
Excellent. Well, now we're moving into what is usually my favorite part of doing a webinar, and that is the Q&A part of the webinar, questions and answers. Our first question here is from Christopher, and Christopher asks, for a loose rubber berm trap, how deep does it need to be to effectively stop .308 caliber rounds from, say, 50 yards or even 25 yards?
Well, thanks for the question. You know, I can speak, you know, tried to make this informative and being general without, you know, speaking just of Range Systems products. But to answer this, I can only speak to our design. I think it holds true for the most part, but for those calibers, we use an 18-inch depth. That gives you a straight line of over 24 inches. So based on our angles and the angle of the ramp, and as far as the distance, that can be anywhere from point blank range to as far out as you can hit the trap.
All right, our next question is from Jimmy. Jimmy asks, if money wasn't an issue and you average 11 million rounds downrange a year, what would you suggest? Ooh, that's a big one, Jimmy.
Yeah, it's a good question. There are some factors, for me to be able to answer that, fully with your benefit in mind. I would say some of the factors are, what are your revenue drivers? Obviously, you don't want to have to bring a company in to do range cleaning, every 2 months. But how many lanes and how many different bays really would play an important factor into that question. If you have multiple bays, there usually can be pretty minor to no disruption with these range cleaning companies. If your revenue source is really heavily relying on the reclamation and the recycling of that lead, and your other revenue sources are not including downrange activities, then this might be a situation where, if you do the math with that kind of volume, that the bucket recycle method with the steel trap just might be the rest of the trap. But to really give you a good answer on that, I would need more data. But based on what I have, it's really relying on your other revenue sources.
Well, Jimmy has a follow-up question, or statement, I should say. He says, I have 19 currently. In 6 more months, I will have 72. I'm not sure if that's 19 lanes.
Yeah, it sounds like 19 lanes.
19 lanes, perhaps.
Then I would say,
lanes, he states.
Okay. Then I would say, if the assumptions there is you're going to have quite a few bays, I don't think you're going to have much of a disruption of service. You're certainly going to have a lot of volume for these lead cleaning companies. It would definitely be a revenue source for you, and you don't have to worry about collecting the buckets. If any of your revenue drivers are more advanced or tactical training in any of the bays, then I would definitely go with rubber, because you're still going to have a revenue source, albeit less because you have to pay for the service. But with that many lanes, a lot of your fixed costs for those companies to travel and their equipment, they're taken care of. So, that's taken care of in 10 lanes. You got still 62 lanes to generate revenue. So, short of knowing all the revenue drivers, I would say rubber.
All right, we've got a bit of a specific question here from Victor. Victor's in Puerto Rico. He goes, hi, you mentioned the vacuum separator for the rubber traps. In Puerto Rico, there are no companies that provide the service to clean the rubber traps. Where can we acquire the vacuum separator?
It's a good question. They used to be more prevalent, Victor. There is probably the best source would be to contact one of the lead reclamation companies. There are several around the country. MT2 is one example. GB Lead Services, BTI, or Best Technology. Those are a few sources that might be worth reaching out to see if they can guide you. The ones that were around the industry, a handful of years ago, there were some different power, different vacuums with different amounts of power, and those guys would be able to really give you an idea of what kind of what kind of motor you need, what kind of vacuum is best. So I guess that's my best answer, Victor.
All right. We have a couple more questions that have come through here. Daryl asks, and I think this is somewhat related to the topic Jimmy had talked about. Daryl asks, what percentage of commercial ranges are built for the purpose of training versus lane rental time and volume?
It's a good question, and it's a different answer, likely 5 years ago today and 5 years from now. Um, with what we're seeing right now, because of, gun sales are still really, really high, but they're down from the all-time high, I guess. So, I guess you could say it's a down year. So current range owners and prospective range owners are really looking at these different revenue sources. You don't want to rely on, the political environment or, what happened, what's going on around the world to drive your revenue. If it were me, I would make sure that, within reason, I have as many revenue drivers as I possibly can. And I would do a combination where gun sales, rental, down, just firing down range is great. A lot of ranges are doing multiple bays. So they can have, one or two bays that are set up just for that downrange stuff, but they have a smaller bay that allows them to be a little bit flexible with their revenue drivers, during slow times or times where there's opportunity to drive more dollars. So I think the diversity of revenue drivers is more prevalent these days, and it's what I would do. But you may want to consider, if you're going back and forth, you may want to consider ensuring that you have multiple bays to be able to do different activities.
All right, well, it looks like we've got one last question here. This is from Wesley, and he asks, oh, this could be another webinar topic. What are the typical pieces of equipment that owners cut costs on, and what are the typical pieces of equipment that owners spend on? So I think he's looking at a greater view. You've got target carriers, you've got booths, you've got the bullet trap, of course, that we're talking about today. What would you tell Wesley today, Brad?
Sure. I'll tell you that oftentimes where money is overspent is where it should be cut, and vice versa. The answer is going to be a little bit different for everybody, but to try to answer it, not sidestep it, again, I go back to revenue drivers. If something's not going to help make you money and is going to cost you more, that's a bad deal. If you're just strictly concerned with firing rounds and collecting lead and renting guns and that sort of thing, then it makes less sense to have retrieval systems that cost 4 times the price of something that's just going to push the target downrange and bring it back. Now, there's exceptions to the rules where there are range owners who have got themselves a formula to justify that cost, but for the most part, your revenue drivers are selling and renting guns, selling ammo, shooting downrange, renting lane time. Then the high-end, fancy wireless targetry that basically will shoot for you is not going to help drive your revenue. So I would stay away from that. Unfortunately, that's the eye candy out there. People love flashing, they love technology, touch screens, this and that, and they spend the money on that. That being said, we carry all kinds of targetry, and there's all kinds of targetry in the industry, and there are a lot of folks who, if their business plan or revenue drivers are about memberships and VIP, then yeah, it's important to have that eye candy because people will pay higher memberships. They want a really nice place to be, that country club feel. in that case, then spend more money on lane dividers and targetry and fancy LED lights and things like that. If that high membership is not, if it's more training, then those things, the LED lights that have your logo everywhere and the fancy booths are usually not money well spent.
Well, thanks again to everyone who asked questions today. That's it for our Q&A session. And by the way, our next webinar is Thursday, November 30th. Again, we're going back to our law enforcement audience there with how much does a law enforcement shooting range cost. Brad, thanks again for presenting on rubber versus steel bullet trap. Which is better?
Thank you, and thank you to those who participated and asked questions. Hopefully it was helpful.